In 1347, a merchant ship docked in Sicily carrying 12 sailors, and every single one of them was already dead or dying. That ship is the reason half of Europe stopped existing, but the man responsible never touched a single body. The real story is not about a plague. It is about a supply chain. It is about one man sitting at a desk in Crimea making a decision that most historians have never given him sufficient credit for or blame. Buried inside that decision is a truth about how catastrophe actually travels. Not through armies, not through weather, not through bad luck, but through the most ordinary human mechanism imaginable. By the time you finish this, you will never look at trade, at logistics, at the invisible infrastructure holding your world together the same way again. And you will understand something about systemic collapse that most people spend their entire lives failing to see. His name was Janibeg. He was the Khan of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Empire's westernmost branch, and in 1346 he was losing a war he had started himself. The target was a Genoese trading colony called Kaffa, sitting on the northern coast of the Black Sea in what is now Crimea. Kaffa was not a city in the Romantic sense. It was a machine, a processing node. Goods flowing west out of China, silk, spice, porcelain, entered the Black Sea trade network through Kaffa, then moved into the arteries of European commerce. Genoa had built it. Genoa ran it. And Janibeg wanted it badly enough to besiege it twice. He had tried before, in 1343. That attempt collapsed when a brawl between his soldiers and Genoese merchants inside the city walls escalated beyond control, and he was forced to withdraw. Now he was back. He had more men. He had more time. What he did not have, what no general in that century had the language to describe, was any awareness of what was already moving through his own army. Historians believe the plague reached his siege lines through the same trade routes he was trying to seize. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas living on black rats, had been moving west along the Silk Road for years before Janibeg ever raised a catapult. The Mongol cavalry, constantly moving across vast distances in close contact with horses and livestock, were near-perfect transmission vectors. By 1346, the dying inside his camp was catastrophic and accelerating. His men were not losing a siege. They were losing a war against something they could not see, could not name, and had no strategy to fight. Here is where the story pivots. Here is the moment that separated a failed medieval siege from the worst demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. Janibeg could not breach the walls. He could not wait the Genoese out. His army was dissolving from the inside at a rate that made continued siege pointless. Most commanders facing that arithmetic would retreat, would cut their losses, would live to fight somewhere else. Janibeg did not retreat. He reached for the one resource his dying army had in terrifying abundance: the bodies themselves. He ordered his engineers to load plague corpses onto catapults and launch them over the walls of Kaffa. The Italian chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, who documented the siege and its aftermath in exhaustive detail, described what happened inside the city. Bodies landing in streets, the stench spreading before anyone understood the source. The Genoese working in frantic shifts to drag the corpses to the seawall and throw them back into the water. It did not matter. The fleas had already jumped. The infection was already moving through the population of Kaffa before a single body was pulled from the ground. This was the first confirmed use of biological warfare in European recorded history. Janibeg did not know the mechanism. No one in 1346 understood germ theory, understood vectors, understood transmission at the microbial level. He knew only that the dead made people die. He turned that observation into policy. What happened next is the detail that almost never makes it into the textbooks. The Genoese escaped. They loaded their ships, abandoned the city, and fled, which is precisely what Janibeg's catapults needed them to do. A city under siege contains an outbreak. The walls that kept Janibeg's army out also kept the pathogen in. The moment those walls opened and a panicked fleet scattered into open water, the containment ended. The ships stopped in Constantinople, then Messina in Sicily, then Marseille, then the Italian peninsula. At each port, they unloaded cargo, they took on supplies, they made contact with dock workers and traders and merchants, and they left behind something that no harbor master had any protocol to stop. By the winter of 1347, the plague was no longer a regional crisis. It was a continental system failure, propagating at the speed of medieval shipping. The numbers are still difficult to comprehend. Between 1347 and 1351, historians estimate that somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population died. In specific urban centers, Florence, Venice, Paris, Hamburg, the mortality rate in peak years exceeded 60%. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived Florence's outbreak and documented it in the Decameron, described streets where the dead outnumbered the living, where the social bonds that had held neighborhoods and families together simply dissolved under the pressure of universal fear. Parents left children. Priests refused last rites. Entire villages emptied over the course of a single month. The infrastructure that had been built across centuries did not just bend, it fractured. Guild systems collapsed when there were not enough workers to sustain them. Church authority crumbled as prayer failed to slow the dying. The feudal labor structure, which depended entirely on an abundant supply of desperate peasants, faced a sudden and catastrophic labor shortage that shifted economic power downward in ways that would take generations to fully understand. Here is what should stop you completely. Janibeg did not invent a plague. He did not synthesize a pathogen. He did not design a weapon of mass destruction in any meaningful sense. He made a disposal decision about corpses he already had. And that single logistical choice unlocked a transmission mechanism that an entire civilization had no framework to understand or interrupt. The network did the rest. This is the truth buried inside the Black Death that William McNeill, in his landmark 1976 work Plagues and Peoples, argued historians had been systematically underweighting for centuries. Catastrophe at scale does not require a mastermind. It requires a node. One decision at one choke point in one tightly integrated system. And the system itself becomes the delivery mechanism. Janibeg did not kill half of Europe. The trade network he was trying to conquer did. He only gave it a push. Consider what your world depends on right now. Not the visible architecture, the hospitals, the governments, the roads, the invisible architecture, the container shipping lanes, the server clusters running financial clearing systems, the cold storage networks that keep your food supply continuous, the logistics software quietly rerouting packages around a weather delay you never noticed. Every single one of those systems is a CAFA, a processing node in a network so deeply integrated that a disruption at the right choke point can move outward at a speed that no human response can match. The Black Death did not spread because medieval Europe was primitive. It spread because medieval Europe was connected. And connection, the same force that made the Silk Road profitable, the same force that let Genoese merchants move Chinese silk to English nobility in a single trading season, is also the force that makes systemic collapse possible at scales no one planned for and almost no one sees coming. Go back to that first sentence. A merchant ship. 12 sailors, one dock in Sicily. You probably imagined death arriving on a ship. What actually arrived was the downstream consequence of a siege that stalled, a catapult that launched, a fleet that panicked, and a network that did exactly what networks do. It distributed the load until every node had received it. Janabeg died in 1357, likely of plague. He never knew what he had set in motion. He never knew that his failed siege would reshape European labor markets for a century, help accelerate the end of feudalism, concentrate inherited wealth in ways that quietly funded the Renaissance, and permanently alter the immune genetics of every European population descended from the survivors. He wanted a trading post on the Black Sea. The next time something moves through a system faster than anyone expected, a financial contagion jumping between banks, a supply chain failure cascading across industries, a piece of information that becomes something no one can take back. Remember that it almost certainly started with someone trying to solve a much smaller, much more ordinary problem. The network was never the tool. The network was always the point. If that reframe is worth sitting with, pass it to someone who still believes catastrophe requires a plan.